This video is brought to you by Spring Bling and also my inability to speak. Enjoy. Okay, we did not talk about a lot in our problem of the day today because the majority of the time was spent on a marathon. But I did want to talk through what we did in the problem of the day because it is pulling together all of the different things that you've done both in this unit and the unit prior. Thinking about percents, thinking about equivalent expressions, and thinking about guess, check, generalize. Last Friday's video, maybe I didn't make a video of last Friday. Last Friday, we looked at how you could use different equivalent expressions to represent various verbal situations, and that the variable can give you information about what that expression is going to look like. So I picked one scenario for us to look at today. The scenario is as follows. Eric studied M minutes for his Constitution test last week. He knew he had a math test coming up too. He didn't know he had a math test today. He said he didn't realize he had a math test at all, so judging just a little bit. So he studied 25% as much for his upcoming math test. I'll read that again. He knew he had a math test coming up too, so he studied 25% as much for his upcoming math test. Write as many expressions as you can to show how many minutes he studied altogether. So, things that I know. And I had people write kind of in an organized way what information is given, what information do they need to find out, and what could they guess. So what information is given here? Well, I know that he studied some number of minutes for social studies, and that's given as M minutes. We don't know how many, but we know M. I also know he studied for his math test, but he studied 25% as much. And this was tricky for people. We know that if he studied some amount for his Constitution test, and he studied 25% as much for his math test, that does not mean he's studying more for math. He's only studying 25% as much. 25% of 100 is going to cut it into fourths, because 25% of something is 1/4 of something. So however long he spent on the Constitution test studying, he spent 1/4 that long studying for his math test. That's in addition to the amount of time he spent for social studies. But I don't know how much he spent on social studies. So then what information do I need to find out? Well, I need to find an expression that I could use to represent this. It doesn't need to be a number because I don't know how much he spent on social studies. It's going to have the variable M in it since I don't know how much time he spent. I need to find that total though. How could I describe in an expression the total amount of time that I spent on math and social studies combined? And then last and most importantly here, what could I guess? What can I make a guess for? Now you could try guessing, jumping immediately and making a guess for how much time was spent on math. Or you could jump to the very end and make a guess for how much time was spent total. But an easy place to start and an efficient place to start would be that he studied M minutes for his Constitution test. We know that he studied some amount for the Constitution test. I think that would be a reasonable place to make a guess. So if I were guessing here, I would want to come up with some number of minutes that he could have studied his Constitution. People came up with different possibilities, but generally any possibilities that can be cut into 4 pieces ended up being more strategic because then you could easily cut that up into the fourths in order to find the math. So let's start with saying someone in 7C said, you spent 4 minutes studying for social studies. This was a very low study. So if you spent 4 minutes studying for social studies, and you spent 1/4 of that time, or 20% of that time, on math, you're only going to spend 1 minute studying math. So that means I've spent 4 minutes studying social studies, and I've spent 1 minute studying math. Put those two things together, I would have spent 5 minutes total studying. So Eric would have spent 5 minutes. Probably, hopefully, didn't study that much. So then let's go to he studied 40 minutes. 40 minutes is nice because, again, I can cut it up into 4 pieces. If I cut 40 into 4 pieces, each piece would be 10 minutes. So then 40 minutes social studies, 10 minutes math. And if I put all of that together, 40 plus 10 minutes is going to be 50 minutes spent total. And I had students continue doing this until we started to see some patterns. I'm going to do one more, and then we're going to describe the patterns we see here. Let's move away from this 440 kind of area that we've been in. Let's go to 100 minutes. If you spend 100 minutes on social studies, and then you need to spend 1/4 of that amount of time on math, 100, cut it into 4 pieces, math would be 25 minutes. If I put that together, I'm going to end up spending 125 minutes total studying in the week. So for me, this is helpful because I'm not just focusing on, 415, 415. It's going to be a 5 something. Now we can see that because my M changed, I ended up getting different information for the time spent on math and the time spent total. So things that I notice. As I go from social studies to math, I appear to be dividing by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 40 divided by 4 is 10. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So I'm cutting things into fourths, or I'm taking 25% of it. I could think of it either way, and I'm going to show both of the ways that could be represented. So I could write that as, if I spent M minutes on social studies, and going back to the problem, that was given. Eric studied M minutes for his constitution test. If I spent M minutes on social studies and M divided by 4 minutes on math, then I could simply add those things together and say that's how much time he spent on the 2 things combined. Now, I'd also like to think about it in terms of percents. 25% of M is the same as M times 25%. And I want to write 25% in a way that is, it would, for example, be easy to put in a calculator. So 25% would be the same as 25 hundredths, or 0.25. So I could say M plus 0.25 M. And that would be another way that I could generalize this. Now here, if I'm looking at M, and I'm adding 0.25 M, I could combine those terms. 1M plus 0.25 M would be altogether 1.25 M. And thinking about that in terms of percent, 100% of the time plus 25% of the time is combined going to be 125% of the time that he spent on social studies. We know he spent more time total because he had to spend some time on math. So he spent more than 100% of his time. 125% of the social studies test time was spent on math. Okay? So in this problem, there was a lot going on. You had to be able to, kind of as you were reading, parse out some of the given information, such as 25% as much. That means you're cutting it down, that it's less time. Also needed to think about how could you guess something and what could you guess here. Recognizing that because he studied M minutes for his constitution test, that would be the thing we could guess. That's where the variable lay. And then what would be a strategic thing to guess? Recognizing that if you're talking about 25% of something, you're going to be cutting it up into fourths. So having something that is easily divisible by 4 would be useful. I didn't stop after one guess and try to generalize right away. I kept guessing. And as you keep guessing, you'll start to see the structure of what's going on mathematically. I noticed, I take my social studies time, I cut it up, and I divide it by 4. Then I add those things together to get my total. that told me how I could generalize. If I have m minutes, I need to cut m minutes up, and then I would need to add those things together to get my total. Or if I had m minutes, I would need to take 25% of that m and then add those two things together to get my total. These are, down here, you have 3 different equivalent expressions: m plus m over 4, m plus 0.25m, and 1.25m. All are different ways of saying you're going to end up spending 125% of that time, or you're going to spend the amount of time on social studies and then another fourth or another quarter of that time on math. For your test tomorrow, all of the information that I'm going to be asking you about is listed on the study guide. If you are able to find problems and show solutions for that, then you should feel confident for tomorrow. If not, go back through, look at some of my videos from previously. You can also go check out Khan Academy to do some more practice on percents, get feedback from Khan Academy, and then always email me if you have any questions. Have a good night, and once again, come to the dance.